Okay. So welcome to the dialogue in Pride and Prejudice. And I'm Michelle Laro, and this is the Jasna, Eastern Washington, Northern Idaho region. And welcome to our discussion. So anyone have a specific question from the discussion questions that we set up beforehand that you might like to start with, or?
The first question that you ask about Mr. Bennet, how he talks to the women in his family throughout the novel, is kind of problematic. And I've read this novel obviously far too many times, but I've never actually caught that until you specifically said, how is he treating these women? And um, he doesn't listen to things that they say unless it's something that he can make into a joke. He's actually quite disrespectful. I mean, potentially, would we say he's a bit of a misogynist? He refers to women as silly. Uh, he doesn't, really show any of them much respect. And I hate to say that because I like Mr. Bennet.
How many people have read The Other Bennett Sister by Janice Hadlow? I feel like that novel like really opened my eyes to the notion of like, what would it be like to live with him if you weren't Lizzie? Because he is awful to all the other women. Yeah, any other thoughts?
I think, one of the things is it is absolutely 100% true that he's horrible to the other women. But, and I guess this is kind of one of those things that when you read a novel that was written hundreds of years ago, cultural practices were just so different back then. And, as a woman, I'm very, very happy to be a young woman in, the 22nd, in 2023, as opposed to back then, because of how, look at how women, were, what their limitations were, even if they were a wealthy woman, back then, there are so many things that you didn't have control over. Right. And so I 100% agree with what is being said about how he responds to women and how he, won't spend any time with them. And these are his children and that sort of thing. But I think it's, if we're looking, we have no choice, right? Because we're living in 2023. So we look at him, with kind of our culture and we bring that. But I would wager that how he treated his children and his wife was probably pretty consistent with the time. And to be fair to him, and I know I'm sounding like a horrible person right now, but to be fair to him, if Lydia was my daughter, I would probably want to pretend like she wasn't. I'm a horrible person. For what I just said, I know.
I think I would just like to speak in Mr. Bennett's behalf that I grew up with a lot of sisters and I identify with Mr. Bennett because he's calling them out for how they're behaving. And he's very kind to Anne, the oldest sister as well. And he tries to be, but he's a single man surrounded by women. So I kind of look at him like I have a very personal connection to him. My father, how he reacted with all of us girls being silly, doing dumb things to impress boys. I saw it as like, oh my God, the world has not changed at all. There are still fathers of daughters who find women unfathomable. He was kind of the lone man amongst women, and I think he felt the power of what their choices were, but he knew he couldn't do anything about it. His hands were tied by the law of the time. So anyway, that's just my 2 bits.
I think when Jane gets her heart broken, though, he's not very sympathetic. And Cindy, what were you going to say?
I had an observation comparing Mr. Middleton and Mr. Bennet. You know, in both cases, the women try to get this patriarch to describe someone in the or someone that they haven't met yet, either Mr. Bingley or a Willoughby. And in both cases, you know, I think Middleton was able to say, well, he's got a good hunting dog. And the girls, the Bennet girls, couldn't get anything useful out of Mr. Bennet either. I thought it was interesting. There must be someone that Jane knew who she based these characters' descriptive abilities on. And one other observation is that while the story does clearly bring out that Mr. Bennet didn't do a good job of managing the finances so that he could give his daughters a decent, you know, a better dowry, Jane doesn't feel necessary to include any of that in the lamentations about their fortunes in the conversations between Jane and Lizzie, which I think is interesting. They talk about a lot of other practical limitations, but they never bring up the fact that their father kind of left them high and dry in some ways.
Sorry, I'm having trouble managing the waiting room and
Well, wasn't the Bennett family's income, I thought I read somewhere it was £2,000 a year. Is that so? How does that translate to providing 5 daughters with a decent dowry?
Well, remember, he talks about if he knew he wasn't going to have a son, he would have started saving sooner, putting a little bit aside every year. That's kind of what I was thinking of.
Yeah,
that
good point.
He didn't bother to do that. And once he had three daughters and no son, he should have probably thought, odds are not looking good that he's going to have a son.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
I'm looking to see if I can turn it off.
any other thoughts on Mr. Bennet? One of the thing that so I had mentioned in the questions that I have this book by Howard Babb about dialogue that really was a great book. It's from 1962. So one of the things that he says is like, we see his mask fall when he's worried that Lizzie is going to marry Darcy without love. And that, you know, for 1 minute, he's serious and tells her, you know, like, don't marry someone that you don't respect. You'll regret it. And like, he's human for a minute and you sort of see that, and then the mask goes back up. But yeah, it's like, you know, so he's kind of like the bad story of Lizzie. Like, Lizzie, this is how your life could be if you stay cynical and sarcastic. And, you know, we have this one glimpse of him being human.
I'd like to talk about him in a way that I find it so interesting that so many people get a kick out of Mr. Bennet, because I think he's an absolutely horrendous person. For example, like a lot of the free indirect discourse throughout the book is very much filtered through his point of view. And it's all related to how he's going to get amusement out of the daughters. And it's like he's constantly sort of setting them up to make fun of them. But interestingly, from a societal point of view, we look and we kind of go, oh, those girls are so naughty. But he's the one that's actually encouraging it. Like, as in, well, it's my job to make fun of people. He says, oh, it's my job to make fun of the neighbors. That's what it's all about. Even the first, you know, paragraph, it's a truth universally acknowledged. It's that, I think that's his voice talking about like how ridiculous his wife and daughters are. But the thing is we all know, they're the opposite of ridiculous. They are required to have a man in order to live. And given the fact that like Mrs. Bennet is the one that came with money, she brought her fortune to the marriage. He had property, but nothing else. So the fact that he actually, besides a property, came to the marriage with nothing, and then still didn't manage the money that she had brought very well. And then all he does is sit around there and make fun of everybody. I'm like, oh my God, he's negligent, right? Oh, it drives me crazy. That's all.
And I know, I think Francis, you might have had your hand up first. I think that Zoom puts you in order of when you put your hand up, and then we'll get to, is it Jamil? Okay, so start with Francis.
Thank you. Hearing this discussion is making me think that actually maybe Mr. Bennett is just miserable. That's why he is the way he is, because he's disappointed in life. He hasn't managed to have a son. He thinks his wife is an idiot. And so all he can do to make himself happy is, you know, poke fun at things. And that's how he manages to have any kind of enjoyment, which is really sad. But that's about all he can kind of do. And maybe he buddies up with Lizzie because she's really smart and she could be like the son he never had. He's got no one he can share the burden with. Yes, his wife came into the marriage with £5,000, but he has, you know, 2,000 a year, which is reasonable for a family. But yeah, when you've got 5 daughters, that's only £1,000 apiece for a dowry. And as far as I'm aware, landowners didn't necessarily make the habit of saving their yearly income, which is unfortunate. And he's, you know, Jane Austen points out, and I was like, I mean, if his wife didn't just spend money, perhaps he could have saved some, but because he was so kind of depressed about his life and assumed he'd have a son, he didn't. But yeah, actually making me feel a bit sad for Mr. Bennett now, even though he is not nice to people. I didn't swear.
Jamil?
Yes, I wouldn't take any offense to the banter and wit that goes about in the household. I mean, I think that Mr. Bennett is a little bit in survival mode. He's in a house full of women. I used to live in a house full of women, my sisters, my grandmother, my mother, me, and I know how crazy it can get. And if I were the father of the household, I would probably lock myself up in the library as well. And not to forget that we're talking about a different time. So I mean, the expression of fatherly love is not what we, you know, would expect nowadays. So I don't think there's anything that would indicate that he's necessarily a terrible father or terrible person. Just you know, he has his defense mechanism, you know, that veil goes up and he, you know, distances himself. It's survival mode for as far as I can tell. So I don't know.
How about other questions that are intriguing? Oh, Gertie, yeah.
Hopefully you can hear me, but I can't believe that people were so much different 200 years ago. I think Mr. Bennett's behavior is still very rude. I mean, by the time you get to the point where you're making one of your daughters cry, because of the fact that you're telling jokes and, you know, she's sensitive. And again, they're some of them are young women, you know, 15, 16. They're not in their 20s like, you know, Jane or Elizabeth. It's kind of rude. You would think there'd be moments of remorse once he's gotten somebody to cry, like he knows he's gone too far. And I never see any remorse from him really, in terms of his behavior. He really loves spinning up Mrs. Bennet. You know, he doesn't listen to the girls when they give him advice, even when Elizabeth comes back with the great notion that maybe Lydia shouldn't go to Brighton. You know, he doesn't care. This is his favorite, but he still doesn't listen. So I really find him very unsympathetic. And again, Lydia's 15. They knew a long time ago that they weren't going to have a little boy. And he knew the entail was there. And basically, he's just living a lifestyle that if he dies, suddenly will leave his wife and daughters destitute. It's really kind of crazy and irresponsible. So no, I don't like him at all. And I don't think, you know, fatherhood should have changed that much in 200 years. He should still be very kind to the people in his family and at least know when he's gone beyond the line, when he's made somebody cry. So.
Jane, A.K. Kirk.
One final charge to lay at Mr. Bennet's door. When Mrs. Bennet is being outright rude to Darcy, he does not step in. He really needs to step in there because he knows who is the top dog between Darcy and Bingley. So he lets Mrs. Bennet be rude to Darcy. How does he not think that that's going to be a problem? Boo! Badly done. Badly done.
Cindy?
So one other observation, at least from my perspective on Mr. Bennet, is that he strikes me as the kind of guy who is a touch lazy. In a lot of the scenes, he lets Mrs. Bennet make the decisions, make the calls, and he's just passive aggressive if he doesn't really like the call that she's made. Only a few times does he actually step up and engage, like when he has to go to London and try to find Lydia, or trying to think of another case. Well, for example, when he says, absolutely not, I'll never let Mr. Wickham in my house. And then after they badger him, a few days later, here comes Wickham. Or, Lydia has to go to Brighton because I'll never hear the end of it. There'll be no rest for me until it happens. He's either struck a very improper balance with his wife in terms of who's calling the shots in the household, or he's just one of these guys who likes to not have to do too much. He's lazy. He lets her do all the hard work until there's a few times where he pokes his nose in. And I think the most interesting one is where Mrs. Bennet demands that he tell Lizzie she has to marry Collins. And that's the one time he goes against his wife in a heartbeat. So, I guess when it gets to something that really matters, he overcomes his laziness. But I think in general, he seems like he's got a good lazy streak going on.
Yeah, anytime Jane Austen calls a character indolent, you know that there's like something morally lacking with them. All right. How about other questions, or it doesn't have to be from the discussion topic, it can be others. We haven't touched too much on the discussions between Elizabeth and Darcy yet. Yeah, Chuck?
You're on point. So the last section about Elizabeth and Darcy and Bingley, the question 10, and I think this has come up before. It says, I've always put out when somebody suggests that Darcy doesn't really need to change. And sometimes I gotta ask, have these people actually read Pride and Prejudice more than once? Because Darcy, I've argued this before, that Lizzie nailed Darcy in her refusal. He's arrogant, conceited, have a selfish disdain for the feelings of other. And because Darcy does recognize her as being highly intelligent, he realizes that this is probably significant for somebody of her intelligence to be telling him this. So, in 10 there, it's from Babb, I believe, says that some writers argue that Darcy doesn't really need change much in essentials from the first proposal. I would argue that Darcy, of all Jane Austen's characters, I would argue that Darcy has transitioned the most. He has changed the most of any of her characters. He went from totally disdain for those around Lizzie to wanting to help them in a matter of couple months or so. So I disagree with that assessment in question 10.
Yeah, I think a lot of people find the first proposal romantic. And it's like, it's almost like this, he's basing his proposal really seems based on like his passion, which I guess people find romantic. I don't know why, but for Jane Austen, it's like, if you don't know the person that you're in love with, and know their flaws and accept their flaws, that is bad love. And so he may love her, but he doesn't know her, and she doesn't know him. So like, there's no way in hell they should have gotten together at that first proposal. Yeah, I kind of feel like the first proposal is sort of like the Willoughby and Marianne, you know, it's like, yeah, I'm really attracted to you. But yeah, I don't really like your family. And it seems like in their conversations, he does see her as an intellectual equal, but it feels like in the proposal, he doesn't see her as a social equal. And that's like bad news for any kind of marriage.
And one thing we don't see in the novel, but we know had to happen, is that Darcy underwent radical reflection in that short period between the first proposal and when Lizzie finally came to Pemberley with her aunt and uncle. He underwent major reflection and had to rethink how he treats people, not just Lizzie, but maybe he started off with how he's treated people around Lizzie. And I have no doubt that, you know, if that was written in the narrative in the book, we would see that he is seriously thinking about how he has behaved and acted around other people of any station or status. And I think he's come to a realization that he's been wrong. So when she finally comes to Pemberley, he realized he's got to make it known to her that he understands her now. He does understand her at this point.
Francis, what did you want to say?
I think Charles has got a good point that Darcy develops off page. We don't get to see his growth. Suddenly he just appears and is being nice, and everyone's like, what's happening? But the changing in essentials, that's something Lizzie says to Wickham, that she doesn't think Darcy's actually changed in essentials. It's just that she understands him better. And you could argue that that's the case. Like, he maintains the same values, but he maybe applies them differently than he used to.
I think like the central growth. So I think the hero's arc in all of the Jane Austen novels is that the hero has to understand the position of people not in power. That like Darcy has this connection with his sister, and he can understand what his sister feels. But he doesn't really understand, just in general, people who don't have power and what it feels like to be in that. Like, maybe he gets that intellectually, but not emotionally. And I think they all have to kind of understand emotionally, what is it like not to have power, in order for them to be good husbands to women in a culture where women have no power. That's my feminist background perspective on the hero's journey. But so I think he does change in essentials, because I think it's like an essential understanding that has to change. Nance, go ahead, Nance.
Turn on my mic. Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. I feel that Jane Austen had a wonderful ability to capture what an introvert would be, because I think Darcy represents himself very clearly. He says, I'm not comfortable around people I don't know. He is an introvert in the most profound sense of the word. And that's why when Elizabeth finally gets to know Fitzwilliams and says, well, tell me, how has your cousin been? And, you know, how has my cousin behaved? And she has a little witty repartee with Fitzwilliams. I think she gets a better perspective that who Darcy truly is. It's not that he is, she has a prejudice against him because she thinks he is, you know, all these horrible things. But that prejudice is what is she has to overcome. And some people would say because he is an introvert and that was not understood, they would just say he was a prideful man. So he had to get over his pride to be able to, be with the woman he loves, and she has to get over her prejudice to be with the man she loves. Just very oversimplification, no doubt.
Martha?
Oh, yes. Sorry, I don't have the video going. But even in the first few pages or the first 13 chapters, there are hints that Darcy is well liked by the people at Pemberley, that he is sensitive. There are hints of it. And I found that if I read Jane Austen with sort of an idea that there's humor and sarcasm and sort of a backhanded humor, the subtleties of her writing are what fascinate me so, and the way she develops her characters. But I know I was able just recently today to review the first 13 chapters, and there are hints that Darcy is very kind in certain ways, and I underlined the places, but that's just my opinion. But if you read Jane Austen, she's really quite sarcastic in many ways. But anyway, that's just my take on it. And I do enjoy these meetings. So I will tell you, I'm on the East Coast, and I've been looking forward to this meeting and study the questions. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, so glad you came.
Yes, thank you.
One of the things that Bab says is that Darcy, like at Netherfield, Darcy keeps trying to connect with Elizabeth. He's trying to be vulnerable. He's trying to connect with her. And, it's like, she really is, I think, like just misreading him and kind of playing like this role of,
and Bingley's sister keeps trying to compete with Elizabeth for Darcy's attention. And what I find fascinating with Jane Austen is the characters are known by Lizzie, Elizabeth, Miss Bennet. So you don't quite, every character has 3 or 4 names. So you have to wait a minute, what am I doing here? She's a fascinating writer, just wonderful. Yes. Thank you.
Yes, and I agree to some extent with what has all been said about Darcy, and I do understand that as long as he can get over being arrogant, conceited, and have a selfish disdain for others.
Yeah. It is interesting to think about, like, the dialogue is at Netherfield is really filtered through Lizzie's perception. And if you really look at Darcy's words, they're not as, I think, negative as she interprets them. And I think that she does kind of like misread him. So it really is interesting. I think we do get more of a glimpse of the real Darcy reading those dialogues if you don't read Lizzie's interpretation, if you just read what Darcy says. Cindy?
Yeah, I think if we go back and remember that the original book's title was First Impressions, Lizzie's mindset around Darcy is really locked in on that first impression where he refused to dance with her when Bingley was saying, look, there's her, there's her sister. She's pretty enough too. And he says, nah, not so much for me, not into it. And that sets a first impression that takes her a very long time to get over. So when she's at Netherfield, I think she's seeing everything through that filter still. At least that's my take.
Yeah. And I think she minimizes what she really feels, because the word that she uses when they discuss it with the Lucas family is mortified, which, kind of has the same root as mortal. And so that, kind of some of the original meaning of that word is like a killing. So I think that's a little Freudian slip where she's sort of saying like, this actually hurt me maybe more than I'm letting on.
Yeah.
Gertie?
You were talking about Darcy's metamorphosis and kind of the hero's journey of change there. And I think it started with the proposal because he came in very proud and expecting to be accepted without question because she was so much beneath him in terms of connections and money. But when she called him ungentlemanlike, that really cut him to the quick because of the fact that that meant a lot to him to be a gentleman. I mean, he wasn't just a man, he was a gentleman, which was a particular type of man in that society. And Austen points it out in a lot of characters. You're either a gentleman or you're gentleman-like. It's very different. And I think the next thing that happens to him that I just read about today was when they're at Rosings together. And of course, he already loves her, but when they're at Rosings, Lady Catherine de Bourgh is so insulting to Elizabeth. And finally, he realizes what it's like, that it's not Elizabeth's fault, that she has embarrassing relatives, that he also has embarrassing relatives, and you can't really help what other people do. And so he suddenly sees his mistake. He really can't paint her with, the brush of her relatives. It's not her fault if her mom's loud or her sister is a little loose. Lady Catherine is insulting, to Elizabeth. And, that also lets him know that, they're all very similar. And maybe he and she are far more similar and, than he thought before, that, he's also in the same boat as she is when they get together with family. You can't help family. So I think that helps him change as well, that realization.
But do you think he realized it then and there or afterwards, after the refusal?
I think in that chapter, it does talk about the fact that he is mortified when Lady Catherine tells Elizabeth to go practice the piano in Mrs. Jenkinson's room or whatever, that, she's not good enough to play, pianoforte, that's, in the drawing room, that she's, not quite their class. And I think he, at that moment, realizes that, this is kind of mortifying. I mean, yeah, she is a gentleman's daughter. They are in the same class. And if his aunt doesn't think so, that's wrong of her. There are different things about Elizabeth that are, good that she's just not seeing. She's just thinking about, the family bank account or whatever. And it is kind of rude and insulting. So yeah, I think even at that moment, he sees that, something is going sideways in terms of his family's reaction to Elizabeth. And I think maybe that puts his back up against it, that, I think she's good enough for me. Why wouldn't you think so? How that always is with family, if somebody tells you not to date somebody. So.
Mary had a good question that wasn't in the original question, so I want to share that one about kind of Caroline, and let me just put that one in the chat too. And it's sort of similar to the question that I had about, like, kind of Caroline is trying to kind of express dominance to over Lizzie, and yeah, is that something that kind of backfires for her? Put both of the questions in. And then we also had a question. Oops. Sorry. It's hard to go between different screens. And then we'll get to Janet's question too, about sort of the similarities between Mary and Darcy, about sort of the discussion of pride. Yeah, so any thoughts about, like, Caroline Bingley, and maybe if there's ways, like, in which her, I mean, she's an awful person, and are there ways in which, like, her being so awful might actually, like, push Darcy more to finding Elizabeth attractive?
This is Mary. I that's exactly what I think happens in a way. I mean, he's already attracted to Elizabeth, but then once Caroline starts, needling him about her fine eyes and all of that, and you know, trying to, like I said, in that drawing room scene where she's, you know, picking up the book that's the second volume of his book and all of that stuff. It's just so funny how Austen does all those things. But yeah, I do think some of that kind of at least caused him to look at Lizzie more seriously. Um, the contrast between Caroline's rude comments, we'll just put it that way, and and you know the way that Lizzie acts. I mean, yeah, Lizzie does, but she's never really cruel or mean. She she you know says straight out, well, I don't really like you, or you know that sort of thing. She's pretty direct, but she doesn't really get cruel the way Caroline does. And I think he begins to notice that.
Yeah, isn't there like some standard if you're dating someone, like how do they treat the waiter or the wait staff? That should be your standard of, is this someone you want to be with? Yeah, it's kind of like she's just a nasty person. Like, why would you want to be with a nasty person? So, Francis?
I think that's a really good point that, yeah, Caroline Bingley is vicious and cruel, and Lizzie is not. There's a point where even when she doesn't like Darcy, she checks her smile because she doesn't want him to be offended. That's a real difference. And the way that she and Darcy talk, they have a great banter. And if you don't have Lizzie's thoughts, it reads like flirting. You know how people have that kind of like slightly nasty flirty thing? And because she's smiling at the same time, that might be what he thinks is happening, hence why he's like, well, why won't you marry me? We've been flirting all this time. And the way that she stands up to Caroline is, you know, the same sort of banter, and he can see that and go, oh, this is fun, and please do this more with me, potentially.
Jamil?
I was going to mention, we did a discussion recently of Jane's darkness in another Jasna group, having to do more with Emma, but I think the same general principles of cruelty apply in the sense that Caroline very much could be a character in the movie Mean Girls, no? In a way, switch out the high school behavior and class difference with, you know, the class difference that would have existed in Jane Austen's time. But there was a quote from this article. It was a terrible article, by the way. We all agreed that we didn't like the article, but I think we were going to read something about Christian morals and how this affects this idea of being nice and being mean in society. But it said something about that class difference gives cover to the cruelties we perpetuate or perpetrate without admitting it, the hatreds we deny we bear. So Caroline would most likely feel that she's Lizzie's better, no? So she actually has permission to be that mean, cruel, uncaring person, even though Christian morals would probably dictate that you love others as you would love yourself. In a way, I guess you wouldn't have a Mean Girls movie, just like you wouldn't have a interesting novel if you didn't have this back and forth nastiness, no?
That's a good point. I'd never thought of it that way. Thank you, Janine.
Nance, do you?
I think Carolyn Bingley is an example of pride in the story, because she doesn't understand how could Darcy be interested in this poor, ill-connected, family's a joke kind of woman when she's there and she's like, I've got 5,000 a year, I've got this title, I've got everything Darcy should want because he's that high up in society. She's like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And that's why I think she is not in her core, I don't believe Carolyn Bingley, because her brother couldn't be that nice and love her. She's just like, wait a minute, you got the whole society has set me up to be the prize, and now the thing that I want to be the prize. You know, I want the guy that I want to see me in that way is seeing someone else in that way. And so I kind of, you know, she's kind of figuring her brother's friendship with Darcy is pretty much going to secure her an engagement with Darcy, because that's how society set things up. But so I think a lot of what she's going through is, yeah, she's trying to put her Elizabeth in place. But it's because she's like, I think she's feeling like she's been betrayed herself. Again, my interpretation.
Martha?
Oh, yes, I want to say something, that the Bingley's money was made in quote unquote trades, which was really looked down upon in English society. He owned a factory or something, where the Bennet money was more on a refined, and they were considered gentry. She had uncles and cousins who were lawyers and didn't live too far away. So I think this is more a question of having ready money versus class, because certainly the Bennets had a lot of class, and the Bingleys had, although the brother was very well behaved, she certainly showed her colors, didn't she? That she wasn't from the gentry, so to speak. But that's just my impression. And Jane Austen was very subtle about all of this. That's the beauty of reading Jane Austen. It takes a while to sink in. 3 or 4 readings of Pride and Prejudice, it's finally sinking in. But thank you. Thank you.
Cindy?
I think this is another one of those examples where Jane was writing on the cusp of the change in society from marrying according to certain class rules to marrying potentially for love. And remember, that was kind of her, I think she was positioning Lizzie as a person who clearly was interested in love over security. And Lizzie's lucky that Darcy had that same mindset. And that's kind of what Carolyn's reacting against. It's like, hey, come on, we all know the rules. I'm the better catch. But I don't think Carolyn has caught on that Darcy might be switching to the other team.
Yeah, and I think if like you think about, like, does the word lady, like, not in a sense of belonging to a certain class, but in a sense of how you behave, I think the word lady is similar to this word gentleman, that there's nothing ladylike about Caroline Bingley except maybe her clothes and her way of walking. And, Lizzie is clearly not ladylike in some of her behaviors of tromping around the countryside. But emotionally, I think, she is a lady. There was an interesting question, I think, from Joanna about, the previous, I think there's maybe a book about whether Darcy, might be on the autism spectrum. And so, I think there's a lot of debate about that. But even if you were just thinking about it as having painful social anxiety or having trouble reading people socially. So, one of the traits of autism is that people with autism often have trouble reading the emotions of other people or kind of social cues. And that probably is a pretty reasonable claim to make about Darcy. So whether you think he meets full diagnostic criteria or not, but maybe are there features of autism that, might connect with what maybe makes it challenging for Darcy when he's with people that he's not comfortable with? What is it that makes it hard for him to talk to people that aren't maybe people that he's familiar with? Just wanted to bring that question up. I think it's an interesting question.
In response to that, I just want to say that I think Jane does a wonderful job of showing how the society that it not only damaged women from reaching their full potential, but it also damaged the men in a lot of different ways. So there could be a little bit of that. I don't think, that's current day looking back. Kind of like hindsight is much clearer. I don't think she would have been in that kind of consciousness when she wrote it.
Yeah. Cheryl, what would you have?
Well, I was just going to say that I find that question of Darcy being on the spectrum an interesting one too. And he does talk about being awkward with people he doesn't know. But it also makes the point that he converses quite congenially with people he's comfortable with. So he's not totally unable to behave in a proper way.
Yeah. I think if anyone fits diagnostic criteria for autism, it's Mr. Woodhouse, but that's a different novel. That's a different day. I'm a psychologist, so I do tend to read and think about what diagnoses would fit people. And I think the other question that Janet had in the discussion questions that I think is really interesting was kind of about the connections between Darcy and Mary when kind of thinking about pride, or kind of how they discuss pride. So I'm going to put that question in. I always like to make sure that we have a chance to discuss questions from other people, people that are coming. So, I'm going to be a little nerd here and share that Mary's discussion is actually from Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. And she, like at some point in the novel, they talk about her reading great books and making extracts. So Kenneth Moeller in the 60s actually did some research and said, hey, she's actually referencing a pretty famous book of the day, A Theory of Moral Sentiments. And then Lizzie's comment that if he hadn't mortified, like she wouldn't mind his pride if he hadn't mortified hers, is also directly from The Theory of Moral Sentiments. But hers is like the zinger, and Mary's is like the plotting and dull version. So it's just kind of interesting to think that, they actually were pulling from kind of the current philosophy or the current, So Adam Smith is well known today for economics, The Wealth of Nations, but he actually was more famous back in the day for The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So I'm sorry I nerded out on you for a minute, but Frances?
No, I love a nerd out. Thank you. Like, that is so Mary, though, that of course she doesn't have any opinions of her own. She's just parroting things that she's read in books. Because if it's been published, obviously it's correct. We don't think about these things critically. Here is a book, therefore it is right. I think in some ways, Darcy and Mary are kind of the same. And if we could say it's the autistic thing that they're like, no, this is the rule that we must follow. And Darcy's like, no, this is how I'm supposed to behave. This is how I've been told to behave. This is what I do. And until he learns that he's supposed to be a different way. So he's learnt from parents, presumably, and she's learned from books that this is the way that things are supposed to be. And then they follow that. Whereas Darcy seems to grow and make decisions for himself as a person. But Mary, at least within the course of this book, stagnates. She doesn't have independent thought. She's still looking to books for guidance without critiquing them.
Yeah. And she doesn't have an emotional connection. Like when Lydia runs off, Mary's got an extract, but she doesn't have like an emotional response. And I think that's why in Pride and Prejudice, she's not part of the Pemberley crew, is she doesn't have the proper heart. So yeah. Gertie?
I just think it's interesting that Austen chooses both of those characters to talk about the same things, and they do talk about vanity and pride to their respective families or friend groups. And I wonder if she's trying to make some kind of a connection between them. Again, maybe because of the kind of cold, unemotional, situation that they both seem to be in, if you want to call it autistic or just shy or standoffish or whatever. Each of them has pride in a certain part of their own character. So maybe that's why they both think they're better than the people who are around them. So maybe that's why Austen gives them both the lines. But again, I hate to think of Mary as like the female Darcy, and I hate to think of Darcy as the male Mary. But there's a reason Austen does what she does. So that's why I think it's fascinating that she gives them both those speeches.
Yeah, and usually, like in Sense and Sensibility, it's not just Eleanor and Marianne they're exploring that theme. It's, a lot of the characters, you can sort of think about where do they fall on that spectrum, and how do you find the balance? And yeah, I think there's sort of that similar notion of like pride with no heart is bad pride, but pride with heart can be really good pride. And yeah, how do you get to that point? Mary?
Yeah, I really enjoyed what Gertie just said. I hadn't quite thought about that either. But what I know some of us do. After the books are over, you wonder what the lives of the characters are after the books are done. I mean, I do it all the time. So, so here I'm thinking, okay, so after Elizabeth and Darcy are married and they start inviting their families to Pemberley, for Christmas or whatnot, well, then we're going to have Darcy and Mary in the same room together. I'm just thinking that I think it's going to be kind of like um, it was in Mansfield Park, where Mary's going to get better. She's going to have to be, and it alludes to that at the end of Pride and Prejudice. So she has to be out in the world more and interact with people more, and you know begin to maybe broaden her thoughts beyond just the books that she reads. And so I have hope for Mary. There was years ago, I guess the last AGM I went to was the one I'm trying to think was where that was discussed. That was one of the sessions, was what happens to Mary later on in her life. Don't give up on her. She's not so terrible. And I kind of really enjoyed that, because you hate to think of her just you know, sitting in a corner somewhere with her piles of books and not experiencing life really. So, anyway, I just do think about what they do later on.
Yeah. I
Well, we do.
really like the other Bennett sister for that imagining of a better narrative for Mary.
I haven't read that one yet. I've got to put that on my list.
Yeah.
Well, we do know in the book that the Gardners and Kitty and Mr. Bennett are the only frequent visitors to Pemberley. So it's unlikely that Mrs. Bennett and Mary would go that way. So I think the book kind of sets down who's going to be at Pemberley and hang out with the Darcys.
Yeah. I always felt like there was a little bit of cruelty in that.
Yes.
But yeah.
A good point.
How about other questions, other conversations that people, yeah, Rosemary? You have to unmute, Rosemary. I'm trying to unmute you, but I don't think I can.
Well, I'm on my cell phone, which I don't usually use, but we're having a little problem with our internet right now. So I'm using my cell phone. So I had a harder time finding unmute. But I was just wondering if anybody or everybody would just like to talk about their favorite conversation in there. I think almost all of us like when they're dancing together, but one of my favorites is when they're at Rosings and Lizzie's playing the piano and talking about Darcy's behavior elsewhere and cluing Fitzgerald in and stuff, but also the way Catherine de Bourgh keeps trying to interrupt the conversation. It just amuses me.
The second proposal.
Yeah. I think the one that Rosemary mentioned, I think is interesting because it brings up the notion of performance again. That was kind of one of the questions. And that connects back to the discussion that they had when they were dancing at Netherfield. So I do like that conversation, and I do like, again, it feels like at Rosings when they're at the piano, like Darcy is trying to connect with her and talk to her as a human being, and she won't talk to him back as a human being. So
I love the scene where he comes to ostensibly potentially give her a second proposal, but he encounters her reading Jane's letters, and they have a real heart to heart, like person to person. That's one of my favorites.
yeah, I think like if you just read that scene, they're going to end up together because they're actually talking to each other as human beings instead of like that real formality.
Mm-hmm.
I think that scene contrasted with the first proposal is really interesting because the first proposal is so formal and like they're fighting not to like be really letting their emotions go. And in the second, in the scene at the inn at Lambton, they're just like the emotions are like all over the place. But they're like, they trust each other too. Gertie?
I like the scene with Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Elizabeth in their wild area next to the house. I think they have a wonderful interaction. I like Lady Catherine. I think she's fascinating to listen to. She says the craziest things. So
yeah. And that scene, I kind of feel like that scene has sort of a parallel with the first proposal in that in both of them, Lizzie is claiming like, I am your equal and I refuse to be treated as less than an equal. And yeah, it's spawned 1,000 t-shirts and obstinate, headstrong girl. Any other
not just I am your equal, but I'm your moral superior.
Yes, but I'm not going to say that to you.
Yeah. I had a question about Catherine de Bourgh's dialogue in that, where she says to Mrs. Bennet, Mrs. Bennet is saying something. These are my children. She's introducing, and Catherine de Bourgh goes, "You have a very small garden." And then they go off and walk she goes off to walk and talk with Lizzie. I've always wondered, was Catherine de Bourgh making a sarcastic remark to Mrs. Bennet, as if your world is so small with that remark? Otherwise, I don't really understand how it fits into the dialogue. So that was just a question I had.
I think it's sort of an insult of, I've got a big estate. You've got a teeny estate. But I'll take a walk in it though.
With Lizzie.
I think I've seen this meme on Facebook of that quote with the picture from the 2005 Lady Catherine saying like Regency burn or something, like you have a very small garden.
Remember, she'd already insulted the fact that the room they were in would have been uncomfortable in summer. And Mrs. Bennet was saying, oh, but we don't sit in here in summer. And Lady Catherine cuts her off and said, let's get to business. I need to talk with Lizzie.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's rude. She's incredibly rude.
Because the shades of Pemberley are about to be polluted.
Although, to be fair to her, she's specifically talking about Wickham polluting, so kind of agree about the polluting by Wickham. But she thinks it's because he's the steward's son rather than he's this awful person. Francis?
I think Lady Catherine is also talking about the fact that Lydia and Wickham eloped, and that sort of pollutant, that shame, would be at Pemberley, which, you know, kind of fear. Don't want to be associated with that.
Stop.
I know we're running out of time. I really wanted to talk about the last question about dancing. And how difficult it was to have conversations while you're dancing because you're moving around and stuff like that. And it is shown really well in the adaptations. And I think probably best is the one in the 2005 where Lizzie is talking to Jane and Mr. Collins at the same time. And you see those two competing conversations and the characters actually stepping out of the dance to be able to continue the conversation. I think like you get that it's really difficult, but people didn't get a chance to speak privately because you could get up to naughtiness. So this was the only time you could speak privately. But having said that, there are people all around you who could be listening to your conversation anyway. Like the people dancing next to you, the people you're crossing hands with could be hearing your entire conversation. And like that feels kind of suffocating, like there's no privacy.
And you're wearing gloves, so there's no touching skin. Yeah. All the adaptations where they're not wearing gloves, they've got it wrong. But did people have a chance to watch the videos of the adaptations? I really, my preference for the adaptations is the 1995 one, but I really like the scene in the 2005 one. Keira Knightley is like so fierce in her anger in that scene, which I think is kind of interesting. I feel like that in that movie, like that they like were given directions to like play your emotions to 110%. But I think like it is very well done, and I like how they have the people fade away at the end. But yeah, so any other thoughts about the adaptations and kind of like how they played that scene or? Well, we've got about 15 minutes left. Is there any question that anybody had that we, didn't have a chance to discuss? And it doesn't have to be from the discussion questions. It can be from any. I think one thing that's pretty interesting when you read through the conversations and really pay attention is how, like the first conversation that Lizzie shows up in, she's really a pretty minor character in that conversation. And her like role kind of evolves over those early chapters. I just think that's pretty interesting, like how Jane Austen kind of has this evolution of character development through what they say. Cindy?
One of the things that hadn't really dawned on me as many times as I've watched the movies or the adaptations and read the book is that the plot in Pride and Prejudice really hinges on Lizzie deciding not to be honest with her father, like she is with Jane. If she had even hinted at Wickham's character without, being specific about how she learned it, it would have changed the course of the story. And that's the only time we really hear her asking Jane's advice about should we share this with our acquaintance. And of course, they decide, oh no, we have no reason to let people know Wickham's a cad. But the fact that she chose to kind of clam up on her change of heart about Wickham's character so completely is what enables the whole elopement and everything else. So the story really pivots around her deciding to clam up there. And I hadn't really put my finger on that before.
Yeah, and like the plotting is so, like, I think the plotting of Pride and Prejudice is so amazingly perfect that like her actually deciding not to do that does seem in character, because it does kind of feel like nobody would believe me and I can't say why I know this. Yeah, it's like it feels like the perfectly plotted novel. Like coincidences.
There's one remark where she says to one of her sisters, when they say that Wickham's become engaged to the redhead with all the money, and they say that, well, maybe, and then that engagement gets broken off, and she says, yeah, maybe Mary's the one who came out on the good end of getting away from him. But it's kind of almost under her breath, the way she remarks that, who escaped who.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find it curious, would Mr. Bennet have given credence to Elizabeth's concerns if she could not share what was privileged information? Would he have dismissed it without the details, or would he have accepted it because he trusts Lizzie's judgment? Although he didn't take her recommendation on not letting Lydia go. So
yeah.
So maybe he wouldn't have taken it unless he knew the full story, which she wasn't at liberty to divulge.
Good question.
But he says that she's not, the part of the reason why he lets her go is she doesn't have any money. So he doesn't feel like anybody would be a threat. He doesn't, even if I believe, and you guys have changed my mind about Mr. Bennet based on kind of the initial discussions that we've had. So thank you all for letting me see some other viewpoints. But I do think that I just, like we've kind of said, Mr. Bennet just didn't feel like any of his children had anything to offer anyone in a way that would make them fall prey to someone. And so I think that Mr. Bennet was kind of in his own world and thought, oh, nothing's going to happen. It's going to be fine. And that's sort of a lazy way of thinking, right? That's the lazy way. I'm not thinking about the consequences of my actions. So I don't think it would have, I agree. It's a very interesting plot device. And the other interesting plot device is that Wickham ran off with Lydia. How is that going to benefit him? He had to have known, somehow he would have benefited, from a financial perspective. So that's another interesting correlation to that. But I don't think it would have changed Mr. Bennet's thought process.
It seems like Mr. Bennet doesn't believe that like a woman could experience, like in his mind, she's not prey because she doesn't have money, but it's like, hey, someone could still, run off with her and not want to marry her. And then her life will be ruined. And it's like, he doesn't have the imagination to think that. Seems like a pretty big flaw for a father.
Well, maybe he has more faith in Lydia than, he doesn't think that she would stoop that low.
Thank you. That's what I raised my hand for. And Jane too, as well. He wasn't concerned about either of those two. He believed that they would make the right decision.
Well, I think the only excuse for Lizzie not saying something to her father about Wickham is also that she just didn't suspect that Wickham was at all interested in Lydia. And again, you know, clearly that wasn't the case, but
You know, when Wickham was still in Meryton, he would dance with Lydia as often as he danced with Lizzie. And he also commented on her age at one point while she was on this, she was out in the yard, and Lizzie corrected.
I think
And Miss King.
I don't think Wickham was as interested in Lydia as he was in just a 15-year-old girl, any 15-year-old girl, because that was the age of Darcy's little sister when Wickham tried to run off with her. So I think we have, you know, a character that would not have been identified in Jane Austen's day as basically a sexual predator. And that was his ski, you know.
He likes the virgins.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also think, this is Mary, I also think that Lydia probably was not shy about being interested in him either, because she just kind of threw herself at whoever. So I think there could be a case to be made for her going after him to a certain extent.
He's a flirt.
Yeah. And he would have sucked that right up, you know. Oh, great.
Which again, that sort of like connects with Willoughby, with him taking advantage of Eliza, and both of them are totally not gentlemen in saying like, oh, well, you know, they kind of threw themselves at me, so who was I to say no?
Right. Yeah, blame the victim, you know.
Yeah.
And Mr. Bennet even tells Lizzie, you know, that he knows Lydia won't be satisfied until she's embarrassed herself in front of some group somewhere. So he recognizes that she's a high on flirt, but he thinks her lack of money will protect her. And like someone else has already pointed out, doesn't give enough thought to the fact that her virtue still could bring a lot of shame on the family if she loses it.
Yeah. Cheryl, did you have your hand up because you wanted to say something? Okay. All right, so we've got 5 minutes left. This has been a great discussion. Any last minute thoughts?
Just an observation. Elizabeth Bennet was born 200 years too early.
I'd like to think that somehow Jane Austen's writing like enabled women to imagine different lives, and you know, like women get to be a little freer now because Jane Austen like imagined this possibility of women having like their independent life, their own moral identity. That was pretty radical at that time.
I just read an adaptation of Emma from Mr. Knightley's point of view, and it struck me again, which I've had other times reading Austen's books, that you want to just say, if you could just say what you mean, which you weren't allowed to do from a societal standpoint. But I think about even today, how many times people are constrained from coming right out and saying what they really think because it might hurt somebody's feelings, or they're just not brave enough, or we haven't totally escaped that, even though we've escaped some of the social strictures.
Yeah.
I have to throw in a comment about raincoats. After rewatching 1995 Pride and Prejudice a few days ago, the scene where Jane is getting totally drenched riding that horse over to her lunch with the Bingley sisters prompted me to look up online, when did the raincoat get invented? And the answer is 1824. Before that, they just really didn't, at least people who were in polite society didn't have the option to, you know, to have a decent rain shedding device. I mean, they had animal skins, but I don't think the Bennets would have worn those. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out because, you know, she gets so drenched, and it's like, why didn't she put on a raincoat at least to be presentable when she got there?
I love how the adaptation like shows her getting sick immediately. I'm riding in the rain and now I'm going to throw up in another hour.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been lovely. Thank you all for coming. And like I said, we'll make the video available and I'll send you the link once it's, it sometimes takes a little bit of time to kind of process the video. So it might be a couple of days, but anyway, we love having guests and thanks everyone for participating and hope everyone has a great day. And I'm already thinking about what our next fun topic is going to be. I think it's more fun to do like a kind of intersectional topic rather than just doing a specific book, you know, like we're going to talk about Sense and Sensibility. So anyway, we'll keep you posted on our next Zoom meeting. And thanks everyone for coming. Take care. Bye.